Today on CityCast Chicago, Larry Hoover, or King Larry, is a name known in Chicago for the better part of 50 plus years, often spoken alongside infamous mobsters and gangsters. But how much of the stories are myth and legend? And what do we really know about the co-founder of the Black Gangster Disciples Nation, whose federal prison sentence was just commuted by the president? It's Thursday, June 5th. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. Now, while Hoover's federal prison sentence late last week was commuted, the 74-year-old will remain in prison as the state works out what to do about a separate sentence. Back in the 70s, prosecutors charged Hoover with ordering the killing of a young man suspected of stealing from the gang. Then in the 90s, federal investigators charged him with continuing to run that gang from prison. But we wanted to know more about Hoover's background, how he got here, dig through the headlines into the details. So we brought in Dr. Lance Williams, a professor and author, including the book King David and Boss Daily, The Black Disciples, Mayor Daley, and Chicago on the Edge. Thank you, Dr. Williams, for making time for CityCast Chicago today.
And the thank you is reciprocated, my brother. Thank you for having me.
Dr. Williams, before you were 30 years deep in not only scholarship, academic work, research, but also you've done direct work with community organizers, with gang interventionists, with violence prevention work. But before all of that, you were a kid growing up between Bronzeville, Washington Park. Do you remember the first time you heard the name Larry Hoover?
It was very early in my life. My father was an outreach worker, very similar to the guys that you see on the street today who work for the larger violence prevention organization. So my dad was kind of an interrupter, worked in a violence prevention community. And as a kid, I used to hang out with him, mediating conflict around the city in different neighborhoods. And so sometime in the 60s, it had to be that I first heard the name Larry Hoover.
I, like you, cannot remember the first time, but I do know it was a name that rang throughout my neighborhoods. I grew up between Woodlawn, Washington Heights, parts of Chatham. But interestingly enough, my entire life, he wasn't somebody you could touch, you could see throughout the neighborhood. He had already been locked up for some 20 years by the time I was born. But his story, like so many, is initially the story of the Great Migration. Can you talk about where his family settled in Chicago and what his early upbringing was like?
There were two primary migrations, African-American migrations in Chicago. The first, early 1900s, and then the second one is kind of mid 1900s. And his family migrated from the Mississippi Delta area to Chicago during that second migration. And they moved and relocated to the area around 69th and Halsted in Inglewood. He lived on 68th and Green. But his stomping grounds as a kid, as a little boy, was in the vicinity of 69th and Halsted. So that area, which is really what we would consider the south end of Inglewood, it was an area that African Americans were just beginning to move into at that particular time. Anything south of that was pretty much the white community that was fleeing the Inglewood community, but there were still whites that lived in the area. But the interesting thing about the area that he lived is that there was a nightclub right off of Halsted, maybe a block and a half west of Halsted, called the Guys and Gals Lounge. It was really the preeminent hotspot lounge for Black entertainment and culture at the time. A lot of flash, a lot of glamour, but at the same time, it was a lot of hood there too, because everybody came there to, enjoy the entertainment in a lounge. The house that he actually lived in on Green actually overlooked the parking lot for the Guys and Gals Lounge. And because it was a space that, like the nightlife, there was a great deal of drug activity in the area, just general hustling, street hustling in the area. Of course, violence and pimping and prostitution, that kind of thing was prevalent. And as a little boy, he saw that, if he opened up his bedroom window, it was like a television show to him, and he was overlooking a parking lot where a lot of this activity was going on. So I think him and young people his age who were in that vicinity got exposed at early ages to street life, and it was very influential in their lives as well.
I remember coming up. There was always this feeling of whether you were in a gang or not. It was kind of picked for you based on where you grew up in your neighborhood, who you grew up around. Even if you weren't in it, you was affiliated by proximity or by, again, just the people you hung around. You knew somebody in your family. Was that the same during his childhood?
Yes, I mean, I think what you're saying is exactly right. And I think in his case, it was even more extreme because of the conditions of, remember, at that particular time, um, and when we talk about the late 50s, early 60s in Inglewood, it's a community in massive transformation. There's this influx of African Americans who had just been displaced from Bronzeville. We're talking about tens of thousands of poor families being pushed off the land in Bronzeville into communities like Inglewood and Woodlawn. This is also during a time where you begin to have the emergence of Chicago's first black major street gangs in the form of the Disciples and the Blackstone Rangers on the South Side. You had the Egyptian Cobras, which was the first, major street gang on the South Side of Chicago. And all of that was in the direct vicinity of his community. He was in the midst of that. So it wasn't like it was something that you could choose to participate in or not. It was going to impact your life, and you just had to decide at what level it was going to impact you.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Supreme Gangsters and a 13-year-old Larry Hoover?
The Supreme Gangsters were a small little group of guys in that vicinity that we just discussed in the area, the back end of Inglewood. This is a time when maybe 4 or 5 years in the early 60s, the Disciples had already gained a stronghold. I mean, there were a lot of different small street gangs in the area, but his group was a teen, preteen group, Supreme Gangsters, and they were different than the traditional gang at that time, which would have been groups like the Disciples. Larry's group was more of the exclusive group that prided itself on being very fashionable. They were really into stylish dress. They were the fly boys. They were boys that were, that's who they were. I mean, if you think about it in today's terms, when you think about how fly, like King Von and Dirk and all of those guys, that really, fly young guys, they were like that, right? But they
Mm-hmm.
were at the same time, they were street dudes and tough, sold a little weed. And the challenge was that because gang presence in that area at the traditional level with the Disciples and the Stones and the Egyptian Cobras, those guys were like 5, 6 years older, and they were gang banging just based on gang stuff. And Larry and his guys really weren't into that kind of thing, but they got started to get pressed by the older guys to pick a side, to join up with these older guys in these groups. And they were able to establish a name for themselves because they resisted, but they resisted in a way that they gained the respect of the older guys. So, in other words, you know, the first press was to, try to threaten and intimidate them, and they didn't go for that. Next was to, if you found a supreme gangster, jump on them and beat them up, and they fought back. And then it was gunplay, and they played guns back. And then some of them, Larry actually, and maybe about 5 or 6 month period, he was shot 3 different times. In the midst of all of this, he was able to develop recognition and a name recognition because he never told on who shot him. He just retaliated, and that caused him to gain the respect of the older guys in the neighborhood.
So how do we get from the Supreme Gangsters to, most people would, in shorthand say he's the co-founder of the Gangster Disciples or the Gangster Disciple Nation, but actually Supreme Gangsters links up with the Black Disciple Nation to become the Black Gangster Disciple Nation when he orchestrates a ceasefire with David Barksdale, King David? Like, how do we get to that point?
There were two major groups that were trying to recruit him: the Blackstone Rangers, who were in the Woodlawn community. But you have to take into consideration the Woodlawn community is right next to Inglewood, right? Those were guys like Jeff Ford and Chief Bull Eugene Harrison, trying to recruit him from the West. And then from his to his north was David Barksdale and the Disciples. This is before the Disciples in the late 60s, 68, before the Disciples took on the name Black Disciple. But in the midst of all of this trying to recruit him, finally he realized that this ongoing war was, it was a lot to deal with. There was a lot of pain and suffering on his side and the other side. And so eventually, when the older guys realized they weren't going to be able to intimidate him into joining up, David Barksdale actually reached out with an olive branch to say, hey, look, I like how you carry yourself. And we've had, you're having problems with some of my guys, especially younger guys in my group. But I tell you what, why don't we merge together? And it was, I think he approached Larry in a way that Larry respected. He said, "Why don't we join up?" And he said, "One of the offers I will give you is I'm the king, the chief of the disciples. I'll make you the co-king. We'll share leadership. You're a co-king, I'm a co-king, and we'll merge our groups together. And we'll hold on to the gangster part of Supreme Gangster. We'll hold on to disciple, Black disciple part, and we will become the Black Gangster Disciple Nation." And Larry agreed to that. Some members of the Supreme Gangsters didn't think it was a good idea, but he was able to convince them, and they joined up in 1969 to become the Black Gangster Disciple Nation.
I mean, the city goes through so much in those late 60s and early 70s. We recently had a conversation about how the west side of Chicago, in many ways, never really recovered from like those riots that happened in the aftermath of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. But this ceasefire, right, they come together in 69, Hoover isn't free much longer after that. 4 years later, he's arrested in 73. Can you talk about why he was incarcerated and what his sentence was at the time?
After the merger in 69, one of the things that I noticed, there was a concern that Larry had with the direction of the Black Gangster Disciple Nation. Although he had joined up, I think he was concerned with the leadership. I think David was beginning to have health problems. And it was clear that, he was sick, he was losing weight. And I think that Larry realized that this thing was not going to hold together much longer. And so what you saw him do, I would say early 70s, he started forming another little group that was even smaller within the Supreme Gangster group and the Black Gangster Disciple group. And he just worked with maybe a handful of guys, and they were working in the streets. And some conflict happened within this group, this small group, where some guys in his group got robbed by an individual in the neighborhood that was in their age. The guy was 19 years old. And in the midst of this conflict, I think some of the guys in Larry's group got super aggressive. A young man was killed. And a lot of it came back to Larry because he was the leader of the group, but he was charged in the murder of this 19-year-old young man whose street name was Pookie. And he was, he wasn't the shooter, but the guys who actually did the shooting was in his group. And it all came back. And two of them, Larry, along with a young brother named Didi, were charged and convicted. And they were sentenced to 150 to 200 years in the state penitentiary system. And at that time, Larry was just 22, was just making 22 years old.
I mean, how does the state and like the broader media paint his picture at this point?
He didn't get painted, I don't think, until a little later. So what happens is, remember, we talked about him merging his organization with the Black Disciples. And so he was labeled on the streets as the co-king or king of the Black Disciples. The problem was David Barksdale passed in that same year, right? He died from his health issues at 27 years of age, right? And so that left Larry as the de facto leader of the organization, that he really never was the leader. He never, that leadership thing, it never really manifested itself in the traditional way where he was like the king of all Black Gangster Disciples. But I think because of the label, when he was sentenced and placed in the custody of the Illinois Department of Corrections, that label was on him, was put on him. So you understand what I'm saying? It's not something that really played out in a real way in the streets. But because of the implications of that label, when you get institutionalized, it becomes real. The prosecutors during his trial and his conviction didn't make a big deal out of him. The big deal didn't come until he was incarcerated in the Illinois Department of Corrections. And the way the policy existed in the Illinois Department of Corrections in the early 70s was the Illinois Department of Corrections used a model that we call the boss model. The barn boss model is a model where prisons identify a leader of a gang or two, and they make them kind of de facto mini wardens of the prison as a way to control the population. Because you have to take into consideration the late 60s, early 70s is the beginning of the mass incarceration of urban black males. This is that period that Michelle Alexander talks about in the New Jim Crow, when we get this influx of incarceration of black men from urban areas into state prisons. So the barn ball system was a way for the administration to kind of try to gain control over the prison without really taking a responsibility of hiring enough corrections officers and building more prisons. They just didn't have the capacity to do that. So what they did was they negotiated with the leader. And because he was on paper the leader of the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, which was the largest street gang in the Illinois Department of Corrections system, then he was given this status. And when you are labeled as the barn boss, they said that he had a key to every door within the prison except for the one to get out of. So he was able to control cell assignments, commissary, what happened in the visitation room, conjugal visits, jobs. So when you have that kind of power and authority, just because you're the head of then you could parlay that into being like the chief of a major street gang, because now you have this power that you can negotiate with inmates, right? So my point is, this was a situation that was created by the Illinois Department of Corrections administration.
They always try to describe him as sort of this CEO, but not really talk about his personality or the circumstances he was born into and the way his community was segregated, impacted his upbringing. But it's more or less to talk about how he built some sophistication, super gang and super organization, both in and out of the carceral system, which as you say is described in that way to sort of level blame on one person and absolve the state, both from its role in the segregation, but the deprivation of black folks, both in the South and in the North, but then also how the wave of mass incarceration further disenfranchises.
You hit it on the head. And see, no one is talking about the role that the state played in this. They even I remember one of the aides of Governor Jim Edgar made a statement one time just before a parole hearing for Mr. Hoover, prior to him receiving his federal sentence. And this aide said, "We know, this is the government. We know everybody that Larry Hoover talks to on the phone, all of his visitors. We know who these people are. So if you know who these people are, how does he run a $100 million drug empire out of your institution?" Right. There was also at this time, if you go back and you look at the archives and you look at just perusing the newspapers, there is plenty incidences where wardens, guards, on a regular basis were caught bringing drugs into the facility, bringing weapons into the facility, bringing money, taking money, doing drug deals on the streets of Chicago, right? And they were using Mr. Hoover and the Gangster Disciples and all other black street gangs to make money, to profit from.
Mm-hmm. You talk about him being arrested during this initial wave of mass incarceration, but then you have the 90s, during the Clinton administration, during the three strike era. In 95, it was revealed that Hoover was at the center of an investigation by Illinois correctional officers, FBI, ATF, and this results in him being sentenced to 3 more life sentences. Can you talk about that investigation?
That investigation happens, or in the era that we would consider the crack cocaine era, right? When this crack cocaine era is beginning to reach its peak in across the United States of America. And it's really interesting if you look at what's going on with Mr. Hoover and his organization, the Gangster Disciples at that time. I think something that we have to trace back to the 60s. See, Larry Hoover has always been a part of some very significant street political movements all the way back to the 60s. You can go back and look at the Lord Stones and Disciples, even though he wasn't a leader and organizer, he participated in the Lord Stone and Disciples movement, which was a coming together of the Lords, the Vice Lords, the Blackstones, and all disciples to march for social justice, but particularly jobs in the construction industry in Chicago. And they were a very effective movement, right? And then from there, he was a part of the Young Voters of Chicago movement. This was a political movement to get young people involved in voting, right, in the city. And then once he was incarcerated, he expanded that initiative to the Young Voters of Illinois. In the 80s, he was a leader in Brothers of the Struggle movement, fighting for humane treatment in the Illinois Department of Corrections. The Brothers of the Struggle was supposed to be all Black street gangs coming together in one organization. And it was working, but then it fell apart. And so what he did was he took that same concept, which he was a part of trying to help bring together all street gangs, and he applied that concept just to his organization. And that is when the GDs changed their name to Growth and Development, right? So he's doing all of this political organizing. And right at that moment, here come the feds with this big drug case, right? Charging individuals on the streets of Chicago who are selling drugs. And then because some of them are individuals who are gangster disciples, they attach that to Mr. Hoover as the leader of this. And that's how he ended up catching these cases. Or he's charged with a series of crimes, continued criminal enterprise that included drug selling, murder, bribery, all kind of very serious felonies were wrapped into this continuing criminal enterprise. And so that's what the conviction was. And what it ended up doing is targeting Mr. Hoover and about 40 of the so-called top leaders of the Gangster Disciple Nation.
What was your reaction last week when the federal government, as part of multiple clemency actions, commuted Hoover's federal sentence?
Yeah, but because I was already familiar with his first steps application, that he and those who were a part of his defense team have been working years to submit an application, and also following the attempts of supporters like Kanye and others, many others who were attempting to appeal to Trump during his first administration. I kind of knew that this was coming, but I also knew that commutation was not going to allow him to come home. What a lot of people, I don't think, understand is that in 95, when he was convicted, at his sentencing, because he was in the custody of the state of Illinois at the time of his conviction, that the state had to be a part of his sentencing negotiation for federal time. And the state explicitly requested that if somehow he is relieved of his federal sentence, we request to be able to do one of 3 things. And those 3 things were to request that we would have the final decision. This is the state of Illinois negotiating, that it would have the final decision of whether Mr. Hoover was able to go home, be relieved completely of his federal sentence, 1. 2, come back to the state of Illinois to finish his indeterminate sentence, right? Or 3, request that he remain in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons until we relieve him of his incarceration or his indeterminate sentence in the name of us not being able to handle him as the leader of the disciples.
Do you have a sense which of those three options are likely to be exercised? And as Hoover's family members and advocates continue to request his release by, visiting with Governor J.B. Pritzker, writing to his family, continuing their broader awareness campaigns, how likely is it that that there'd be a state commutation as well?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I have no clue of what's going to happen. I don't know, what the governor and the governor's office thinking is around this.
We kind of talk about how his influence, how his lore is largely due to not only his reputation before being incarcerated, but the ways the Illinois penal system sort of put him in that position. Can you talk about his broader cultural legacy in Chicago over the last 50 years?
Yeah, so it's his legacy, his cultural legacy, particularly within the popular youth culture, is going to last forever because he's an actual architect of that culture. He is the style, he is the swag of the urban black male experience, which the whole world is infatuated with, right? But it's not just that, right? It's that plus the fact that Mr. Hoover, from very early in life, has been involved with the fight for social justice and the fight for political empowerment. Like, we don't talk about that enough, right?
What would you say to someone who hears this conversation or reads these stories and say, this is all a farce, right? There are still those who argue, all of his reformation is just an attempt, and he has since still been running GDN this entire time. What would you say to those people?
This is something that he has been doing, fighting for social justice since the mid to late 60s, consistently, right? He's very easy to find in the literature, in the archives for being a part of these movements, all the way back to the LSD movement. So he's not Johnny come lately to this. He's been doing this his whole life. Secondly, as it relates to him being the gang chief of the GDs and he wants to come out and organize, it's almost impossible for him to come back and take over the Gangster Disciples. Number one, because the Gangster Disciples organizationally, structurally, and functionally no longer exist. Are there individuals who call themselves GDs on the streets today? Absolutely. All over the United States of America? Absolutely. But they are not tied into and a part of an organization that has structure, that has a leader, that has, senior level leaders that they used to have that go all the way down to ranking foot soldiers. That structure has not existed for over 30 years because the feds came in and took out all of the top level leadership. And so since then, that organization has only existed in its fractured, fragmented state. I don't want to make it seem like I know more than anybody else, but in the academic world and in mainstream society, I would be considered an expert on this topic. And I'm saying, as an expert, I am expressing that young men who identify with being GDs today pride themselves in not adhering to leadership. Their culture is about having no leader and having no man above them, that they are their own leaders respectfully within their community, and that they could really care less about GDs off of the block. So there's nothing for him to come back to and lead. Street culture is different today.
What do you think will ultimately be his Chicago legacy?
For those who look at him just from a street perspective, they probably will see him as one of the, if not the greatest street leader of any street organization in the history of the city of Chicago, being the Gangster Disciple Nation. It is by far the largest street organization in the city of Chicago collectively. And Larry Hoover has been historically the leader of that organization. And the people who will uphold his legacy will not just uphold his legacy as being the leader of the street gang, but they will uphold his legacy as being the leader of the growth and development movement. They will be quick to tell you that we are no longer gangster disciples. We adhere to a principle of growth and development and the empowerment of the Black community. And a part of his legacy is going to be that, and it's going to be 21st century vote, organizing the community to participate in an electoral politics. I heard Larry say one time in an interview that real gangsters go to the polls. He will admit that it was a mistakes made, and that if he had an opportunity to go back and change those things, he would. But at this point, all he can do now is try to teach young people not to go down the same road that he went down. And I think all of that is going to be a part of his legacy.
Dr. Lance Williams is a professor of urban community studies at Northeastern Illinois University and an author for whom his books, we will drop links in the show notes. Dr. Williams, thank you for making time for us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, we can't let you go without some good news. Build Chicago celebrates their annual Wear Orange Day this Friday on their Austin campus from 2 to 9 p.m. The West Side March Against Gun Violence will kick off at 3 and will be followed by a community pop-up event with food, music, and games alongside Play Street Chicago. Check the link in our show notes for more information. As always, we appreciate you for listening, reading, for making time for us. We're going to be back bright and early tomorrow, looking back on some big stories from the week. We'll talk to you then. Peace.